otherwise today would have to be too long. So we are going to only cover off 25 slides today, which is relatively short. So we're continuing on with our the biblical church model. We've covered off in the church and gifts. We've looked at elders. We looked at deacons. Today we're looking at offices and church organization or structure. So I've sort of connected these two together. Offices was a little bit short to put on its own, but we kind of needed to cover off a little bit on organization, like how is this church sort of organized and functionally, and why. And then the last point is point 3, or part 3, which is the actual church planting part. That one will have to come when I'm given grace to present next time. So let us go and just quickly do a brief recap today on what we've covered. So we covered the ecclesia, now part 1, which is simply the Greek word for a calling out, and it was often used in a civil context for an assembly of people that were called out from amongst the people, the general city people. They were called out to deal with matters relating to the people. They were called out for a special work. That was the ecclesia. And the apostles started using this word, and over the time it has morphed into this English word, church. But effectively the word church we read in the English Bible is that same Greek word, ecclesia, which simply means a people that are called out for a certain purpose. And we understand that in the biblical context, calling out of darkness into the kingdom of light. We looked at the gifts and how the gifts were kind of like grouped into two. One was sort of the calling, or gifts that were sort of laid on a person for life. When someone was called to be a prophet, when the calling of pastor or shepherding or leading was upon someone, or that even of apostleship was given directly by Christ to the early apostles. And then those gifts that were given as an endowment, or special gifts that God gave to accomplish certain things at certain times throughout church history. We looked at the elders and their work of spiritual oversight and leadership, looking after the spiritual welfare and oversight of the churches. And then we looked at deacons. The word there is simply those that serve, or the servant in the churches. Both these roles, elders and deacons, were the only two in the apostolic church that were actually ordained on a regular basis, and they were said to be in every church. They were commissioned to build churches based upon elders and deacons, ordained personnel in the church, that would oversee the spiritual and all the practical and welfare needs of the members of the local churches. And so that covers off the elders and deacons. And then, as I mentioned today, we're going to be looking at elected officers and church organization. So we're going to start back the front. I've mentioned here officers, then church organization, but it's actually going to be the other way around. Because the officers don't really make sense unless you have some sort of organization. So we're going to treat it in that way. So let's have a look at this. Throughout the created universe of God, we find that God has always done things in a very orderly, organized manner. In creation, particularly, then we find in social human interactions, humanity tends to organize themselves by default into some sort of hierarchical, organized social groups. We find that even in the created animals, outside of human beings, they organize themselves, the ants, the bees, herds, groups of fish, groups of birds in the air. There's organizational hierarchy that takes place by default, as if God designed it into the beings of the creatures and humanity, and we know it is by design. Humanity often organizes themselves in society under governments, where there's some sort of structure and organization, law and justice are brought in order for these groups of people to work cohesively together. And then we find also in the scriptures, when it comes to the church of God, there is also instruction that order and organization is essential. Now, just to give you an example of creation, we look out into the galaxy, and has anyone just recently followed the exploration around the moon that just took place? Yes? Has anyone seen some of the images that have come back from there? And they compare them to the images that were supposedly taken in the first mission? Yeah? It's absolutely amazing, the images that have come back, what you can see, going around the other side of the moon. So it was basically outside of Earth's orbit, around the moon, and then back into Earth's orbit. And, to look out into the galaxy, you can see there's order there. This spiral here is not just random chance. That design there is perfectly mathematical, and you find that throughout all creation, as if there was a designer, which we know there was. And then you find even right down to the human cell, the perfect organization that takes place within each one of those cells, which we have thousands and thousands and thousands within our body, every day doing their ordered, organized function. And disease starts at this level. When things get messed up here, that's where disease comes from. Not disease comes from there, but that's where, when these things break down, illness takes over. But the study of the human cell, with all its parts, is like its own ecosystem. Everything perfectly working to order and to law. And when they all function in order, everything runs well. But when something goes wrong, it all begins to fall apart. And as I mentioned, this example here is of the government of the US, where you have different levels of government that work together in order to bring some sort of civilization in some sort of order, to be able to offer some sort of justice and retribution to those that try to destroy that order. We know throughout history, at times when civilizations have gone into anarchy, what the result is, what it's like living in those places under an anarchic system versus something that has some sort of order and organization. Now, in Patriarchs and Prophets 3:74, it tells us about the church of God on earth. When God called the children of Israel out of Egypt and wanted to structurally organize them as a special people in fulfillment with the covenant of Abraham, to take them into the land of promise and establish them there as his people, it says this: the government of Israel was characterized by the most thorough organization, wonderful alike for its completeness and its simplicity. The order so strikingly displayed in the perfection and the arrangement of all God's created works was manifested in the Hebrew economy. When it uses that word Hebrew economy, it's like their government system, how they operated, how they functioned. God was the center of authority and government and sovereign of Israel. In the time of Israel, God was the head, leading out the instruction, giving of the law, giving of direction, civil, justice, spiritual, moral. But if you read in the book of Numbers chapter 2 and also Deuteronomy chapter 1, you'll find the order that God gave to Moses in order to manage and organize the children of Israel during their wanderings from Sinai until they reached the promised land, which ended up being 40 years, just over 40 years. And in particular, he gave order in which way the sanctuary was to be directed in relation to the sun, because there was idolatry and sun worship. So he made sure that in the direction of the sanctuary, the priest would always walk into the sanctuary to offer and work in the service of the sanctuary with their back to the sun. In fact, later on, one of the prophets speaks of the children of Israel, how they had changed that, and now they were changing and they were facing the sun in their service of worship. And then to all the arrangements of all the tribes all around, with the Levites being those in the center around the tabernacle, and then the other tribes all around in their order with their standards. Each tribe had its own standard or their banner that they all camped around and were in perfect order and harmony. And then through the Old Testament, we haven't looked at this before, but I just want to quickly go through these points here. There was an order that God had placed to help organize and structure the management of large groups of people to accomplish a certain outcome. Now, keep in mind, this was also civil. This had to deal with civil matters as well. So judgment and justice also was carried out in this system on order. So that you'll find there's more levels or more organizational structures in this than we find in the early apostolic church. Because the early apostolic church was not dealing with civil matters. They weren't dealing with land rights and things that we often now, the government deals with, for example, in Australia. Who owns what block of land? Am I encroaching on my neighbour's property? How many generations ago did he own it and he sold it, and when does he get it back? All of those things. Now, we find here, initially, God is outlined. In fact, it tells us in the book of Deuteronomy that God was their king. And that's why it was such an offense when the children of Israel wanted to be like the other nations and said, we want a king to sit over us. Why? Because they were dethroning God. Because he was their king. In fact, the Bible tells us that. It says that he was their king. And then we had Moses, who is the visible representation of God on the earth, the leader that God called to take them from Egypt to the land of promise. And for a start there, during that early period, he was trying to judge all the people by himself. And Moses said to God at one stage, look, I can't do all this by myself. And God says, all right, I'll take some of your spirit and pick out 70 men that are already leaders amongst the people, they're chiefs, bring them out, and I will put some of your spirit that I've given to you on them, and they will assist you with the work. And so we have then the council of the 70. And they were to directly assist Moses, particularly in the judging of the people and leading and managing the people. And then we have the priests, which were dedicated to the work of the sanctuary and the ministry and so forth. Then we had the next level, which was the chiefs, the chief princes over the tribes within the people, amongst the people. So these were underneath the elders. There was in terms of governance, then there was the chief priests. The chief princes that ruled over the tribes. Then there was what we most know the Old Testament and Jethro for, is the officers of thousands, of hundreds, and of tens that were put over the people. So these were separate levels that were given by God to the children of Israel to manage their whole, their government. And then finally we had this term called officers, which was the last one. And that was people given that were called to do certain things carried out for certain times. So just quickly, I'll give you these references. You can write them down or you can see me after. But in terms of the idea of God being the king of Israel, Deuteronomy 33:5 actually states that he is the king of Israel. It uses the word, he was king in Jeshurun, and that is a symbolic name for the children of Israel. And the he referring, if you read the context, is God. He was their king directly. So God being supreme head, authority. Then you have Exodus 19:5-6, you have Deuteronomy 4 and 8. And then Moses, obviously visible leader, he was called the servant of the Lord. He was called directly in Midian at the burning bush to go to take the children of Israel from Egypt and take them to the promised land. Numbers 12:7 and 8, Exodus 18:13, and Exodus 18:19. And then we have the council of the 70 elders. So that's Numbers 11:16-17, Numbers 24:25. I'm not reading all these verses out. You can look at it later on. Then we have Exodus 24:1. And then we have the priests, which were considered the spiritual leaders. In fact, it was interesting because when they come to the point and they wanted their own king, it was the priests that actually anointed on behalf of God the people. So this level here, the priest was not in the place or above. God appointed the leader. God called Moses. And then that calling was put onto Joshua, the visible representation. But later on, the king who displaced God by the children of Israel, Saul first, they were anointed by the priesthood. And then we have the chief princes, or the tribal leaders. Numbers, that's mainly in Numbers and also in Deuteronomy. That level inside of the tribes. So there was the council of the 70 that was overseeing all of Israel, assisting Moses. Then inside of that was then the chief princes, organizing the tribes, that were heads of the tribes. And then we have the captains, and these were people put in charge of specific amounts of groups of people, levels of people. There was the smallest group there was tens, then there was hundreds, 50s, then hundreds, and then thousands. So they were organized into numbers. You see, Moses went through Egypt, and he understood the art of military and running an army. And that didn't go to waste, because later on, as he led the children of Israel, God used those things, those disciplines that he had gained, and he directed and organized, gave him the plan, and Moses then carried it out. And the children of Israel, you wonder, how could 40 years, 2 million, 3 million people live in the desert? The desert. And not destroy themselves. Like, this is a moving Perth going through the desert for 40 years. Imagine that. And they're all in tents, because we have about 2 million people in Perth. Imagine Perth being on the move for 40 years. We have a hard enough time organizing Perth without it moving anywhere. But that's what it was. And so God put in place these things to help it to accomplish what it needed to do, and the people could live their lives for 40 years in tents, wandering across the desert. No gardens, no planting, no stable water, none of that, except for when the water was coming from the rock that followed them. And then finally you had the general people. They were the children of Israel, and the mixed multitude as well at some point there. And this was the structure and the order that was given to the early church. If we reference the early church in this period of time as the children of Israel, this was the order. And there was, as I mentioned, there's the civil side of things and also the church side of things, all in here, one in this organizational structure. But what about the apostolic church, going to the New Testament? Was that as well ordered and disciplined as well? We read in Acts of the Apostles, page 185, it says, churches were duly organized in all places, in Lycaonia and Pisidia, where there were believers. Officers were appointed in each church, and proper order and system were established for the conduct of all the affairs pertaining to the spiritual welfare of the believers. And this is just one of the statements. There was, even in the early apostolic church, initially it got started, there was a little bit of things that were developing the apostolic model. See, the apostolic model dispensed of the need of the civil government side of things. When the apostolic church began and Christ organized that church, he did not incorporate in the civil government into this structure, because they were under Rome at this stage. They had been conquered, the children of Israel. And the apostles coming out were not organizing the civil matters of the land. They were organizing the church, which had a specific mission and work. And so everything organized around that was related to that work to be accomplished. But there was definite organization and order. Initially we find, the Bible even says that the apostles, the church was built upon Christ, the chief cornerstone, and the apostles. They were the founders. And the church was built on top of that and established. And as we go on, as we looked at last week with the deacons, when we come to Acts chapter 6, it says, as the number increased, they needed to begin to put in further organizational structure. So initially it was simply the apostles. Christ had gone back to heaven, the apostles, and the gifts of the Spirit, which were manifest. And that became needful when organizing and managing a large amount of people to accomplish the mission. Now let's have a look. In the New Testament, it kind of looks like this. So we have Christ as the head, chief cornerstone, the Bible tells us. That's Ephesians chapter 1, 22 and 23. And then we have what the Bible says, that the founders were the apostles. It says, the two verses there, Ephesians 2:20 and 1 Corinthians 12:28, where it speak about the apostles as being the foundation. Christ, the chief cornerstone, the apostles, the foundation upon which the church was established and built. So the apostles were the founders, the early ones that established and began the work. And then we have what we looked at in the last two sessions was the elders and deacons, which were commissioned to be anointed, ordained in every church throughout the Christian those that accepted the Christian faith. And then there's something found in the book of 1 Corinthians 12:28, which was the key text we read today, which we haven't so far looked at, and that is the word helps. It speaks about when Paul writes to the Corinthians, he almost identically repeats what he says in Ephesians chapter 4, but he adds in there a little bit extra. He mixes the two gifts. He mixes in their healing, and he mixes their miracles, as well as apostles and teachers. But he also uses this word, offices, or helps is the word he uses. Helps in 1 Corinthians chapter 12:28. And then finally we have the body, or the members. This is what makes up the church. Now, in 1 Corinthians, I want to read this verse here. Chapter 12, verse 28 is the one I referenced. And God has set some in the church, first apostles, secondary prophets, thirdly teachers, after that miracles, then gifts of healings, helps, governments, diversity of tongues. Now, this one here is very interesting, helps. Because it's the same idea that's captured in the Old Testament when Moses was reiterating the organizational structure he gave to the children of Israel, or God gave through him to the children of Israel. Paul says he uses the word helps. So outside of the teachers and the prophets and the apostles and the gifts of like tongues and miracles and prophesying, he speaks about helps. And I want you to notice how the Old Testament uses this in terms of its organizational structure and a certain function in the church. So I took the chief of the tribes, wise men, and made them heads over you, captains over thousands, captains over hundreds, and captains over 50, and captains over tens, and officers among your tribes. The Old Testament uses the word officers, the New Testament uses the word helps. And as a separate function or a separate work within the church. Now, is it necessary that we have the same today? Order, organization, and some sort of structure. Should we have what the early apostolic church had? Or do we have a different church model today? Let's read from the Story of Redemption, page 260. It says this: "It is necessary that the same order and system should be maintained in the church now as in the days of the apostles." Right? So this is bringing us today. So the same system and order today should be maintained as was in the days of the apostles. So how should our church order look like today? The same as the apostolic order, right? The prosperity of the cause depends very largely upon its various departments being conducted by men of ability who are qualified for their positions. Has the mission of the church changed today compared to what it was in the time of the apostles? Have we been given a different mission? Are we to do different things today? No, it's the same. So what about today? Is it enough just to have elders and deacons in the church? Could they do all the work? No. And in Old Testament and New Testament, we find this idea that there were officers and New Testament helps in the church. The word organization is also used in there, organizations. But these two concepts here on the Old Testament and the New Testament, which were not listed in the name of that structure, in terms of the 70 elders, then the chief princes, then the officers over thousands, over hundreds, over 50s, over 10s. Then there's this other group. In the Old Testament it's called officers, in the New Testament it's called helps. So they're not deacons and they're not elders, but they're called helps. And they're part of what I would say today is the elected officers that are given a work to accomplish for a period of time. And some of these examples here we're all familiar with are things like the treasurer, the secretary. There's so many different parts to make a local church run. And the elder, we looked at so far, the elder's work was not primarily to manage all the affairs of the church. His primary focus was oversight and spiritual needs. But the deacon wasn't given all this job either. And here we come to what the Bible says, these helps. Right? The Spirit of prophecy says that we're to bear one another's burden, and we're all called to assist and work in the church of God, in saving souls. And in the saving of souls, there is many things that need to be done to carry out this mission. And so some of those are teachers, Sabbath school teachers. There's mission work, there's youth work, there's helping out in the kitchen. There's all of these areas that need in order to make something function well. Visitation, children's ministry, music ministry, like in our church today we call them departments. So there's the youth department and the children's department and there's all these different areas. But they need someone that will take charge of them, an office holder. And so today we generally structure that in this. So there's not a lot of, like researching through the scriptures and the Spirit of prophecy, there's not a lot that speaks particularly about each single role. But the principle is there, that God has organization and He has order. And He does it by putting people in place and giving them the responsibility to carry out that work. And so today, 2,000 years later, we follow the same model as the Apostolic Church, and principally the same as the Hebrew Church, just without the civil side of things. But there's all these other offices that are not particularly mentioned. The Spirit of Prophecy speaks about treasurer and the clerk or the secretary. Speaks about these other areas like the youth or the mission work or the welfare. But in the local church, the particular offices, they're not all clearly spelled out. But the principle of being organized and orderly, having a accountability and someone responsible for that task is biblical and it is principally based. And throughout history, we've found that this works functionally the best. So church officers is that level where someone is elected to a responsibility to carry out a work on behalf of the church for a given period of time. And I'm not going into detail, I did reference it last time, but Sister White talks about that there should be a maximum of about 1 year term in a local church for someone holding an office. You know that even included the deacon and elder? So the local church would appoint them for that one period of year to do that job in this local church. So an elder, like an elder's ordained and apostles, they were ordained for their life. But a local church would appoint them to carry that office in that local church for that period of time. And then a year later, then there would be another appointment of them, the election, where the church voices would come together and they would decide this elder, this deacon, deacons, elders plural, and then the other helps in the church, the officers, to carry out the function, the work of the church. And so all this is essential in order that the church might accomplish its mission. And what was the church's mission? To rescue those in darkness, bring them to a place of light, the kingdom of Christ, equip and train them to do the same, and upbuild them to the fullness and the stature and the likeness of Jesus Christ. And so every part was to work together in the church, local church. The elders, deacons, and the officers in the church. We're all to work together that individual local church would accomplish its work, its mission. And it's threefold. Keep in mind, it's threefold. The work of the church is threefold. To rescue the perishing, to nurture and build up those that have accepted and come to Christ or on their way, and then to empower and equip them to go out and to rescue. Threefold work of the church. And all of these gifts that God has given through His Spirit, whether they're callings or they're enablings or talents, are to be used for that work. And so I'm going to wrap up today on the offices and church organization. There's so much you could go into more, but we're just going to limit it to this. And just keep in mind, there's 3 levels or 3 elements in the church that work, and there's a three-step process of the lifestyle of the church, life cycle of the church. Rescue, growth, equip to go and rescue. And it's carried out by these gifts that are being given in the church. Let us now close with our final hymn, and the next one we will be doing part 3, no more point, but part 3, and we will be looking at church planting. How does all this work together in going forth with